She thought that Felix would come back even if the others didn't. Her maid, Plana, informed her that Felix was waiting outside because she was not yet dressed. She was surprised for a moment, as she had forgotten. Suddenly, she smelled something familiar, the scent of citrus. She paused Plana for a moment and thanked her maid for remembering that she loved flowers, with their subtle and fresh citrus scent. They sent what seemed to bloom every day after Julia praised them. Plana was creating the blooming flower that had a slightly different scent in each season. She prepared it carefully, mixing in other scents to ensure Julia wouldn't be allergic, all with the hope that it would make Julia happy. However, after Julia became a tyrant, she had to test the scent of citrus, so she took a risk by preparing this concoction for her. Julia believed that she must have added the geranium very carefully to be on the verge of a reaction just because of a small compliment. It was surprising that Julia didn't even do small things. After she finished getting dressed, Plana looked at her with admiration. She was a beauty, with her blue eyes and blonde hair shining like diamonds. The maid informed her that she would fetch Lord Felix, but before leaving, Julia thanked her for coming back. A few moments later, Felix opened the door and entered. Julia smiled and greeted him. When Felix saw her face, he began to cry. He apologized to her, wiping away his tears, and declared that everyone said Her Majesty was back, which made him so happy that he couldn't help but cry. Julia declared that the reason she came back was that he returned to her. It was a bit cheesy, but it was the truth. She needed him because she couldn't survive in this world without a single person to trust. He, being smart, declared that he would do whatever Her Majesty wished. Although she thought it might be a burden to hear this, it didn't feel too bad coming from Felix. Suddenly, she heard noises as a maid informed Duke Fez that Her Majesty had not given him permission to enter. However, he shoved her out of the way and questioned how a mere maid could prevent him from meeting Her Majesty. Panting heavily, he entered the room, seemingly angry. Upon seeing him, Julia's eyes opened wide in shock. This man was Duke Fez, the first person she needed to get rid of within this palace. To make it worse, he looked just like the manager she had in her former life. It seemed the enemy crossed paths on a single wooden bridge because both her previous life and the present were ruined by him. He was the enemy of her life. Duke Fez noticed something different about Her Majesty as he realized she was releasing her swordsmanship aura. She looked at her hand and felt something strange, realizing that this was her aura. It seemed to have emerged unintentionally when she saw a face resembling her former manager. She smiled bravely and declared that it was just a morning exercise. So why was he shaking like a leaf? Did he think she was planning to hurt him? He cleared his throat and declared that, of course, she wouldn't do that. This made her even more furious, as he fake coughed just like her old manager used to. She pondered whether she could get rid of him too, but it was hard to consider that when she thinks of Venus. Part of him wanted to believe in her, so she didn't want to turn that trust into doubt, but she wanted to teach him a lesson. Duke Fez exclaimed, "Your Majesty, why did you bring back those who were thrown out?" She sneered, asking what was wrong with that. He remarked that those were the ones who had been rude to Her Majesty and questioned how she would punish them, saying she didn't care for their circumstances. She looked away, commenting that she had exiled them, but questioned whether it wasn't up to her to bring them back as well. Since when had the Duke become a burden? It was her wish to have them leave the palace. She didn't want them sent to the Tower of Exiles. Was he aware of that fact? Currently, there were 3 powerful Indonesian representatives of the corrupt nobility: Duke Fez, the fallen tyrant Empress Julia, and the revolutionaries with Eustace at the center. The revolutionaries that Eustace was leading were not motivated by a temptation for power, but rather by Empress Julia's corruption and misuse of power, which Duke Fez encouraged. They had risen up as their patience was dwindling. But what if Julia suddenly went against Duke Fez? They would be pleased at first, wondering why Julia would behave that way. If they started inquiring directly, the revolutionaries might monitor the situation, and when the opportunity arose, it would create division among them. Her goal was to exploit that division, allowing her to outmaneuver Duke Fez. Regardless of the scenario, she questioned whether he understood it. He smiled and declared that he would never intentionally disobey her commands. He just believed that this would be more beneficial to her. He couldn't possibly allow those who had caused even an ounce of trouble for Her Majesty to remain in her vicinity. Julia was annoyed that he chose his words so carefully. The one causing her the most trouble was him. Duke Fez spoke ill of the Empress behind her back, but always praised her when she could hear. The one who values their own neck the most knows that running his mouth in front of the Empress saves his neck and can get him what he wants. He must have been very confident, giving the Empress alcohol and medicine. He even invested in these things for her in order to gain power. Since he had done so much for the Empress, he believed she should listen to whatever he had to say, so he must have been flustered after hearing what she said. His face and voice reminded her of her former manager. She disliked everything about him, but there was something different compared to that manager. In this world, she was his superior. She questioned whether he had been undertaking tasks around here like this. He was surprised and questioned what she meant. She tried to assert that he had not accurately executed her orders up until now, but rather made decisions on his own and proceeded to carry them out. He attempted to mumble some nonsense in defense. She commented that if you had seen one, you've seen them all. If he thought he could execute those closest to her, then she could guess how he handled other matters as well. He declared that it was not true and asked how she could doubt his loyalty after all he had done for her for so long. The words of those who tell lies were also a stretch, he declared. Right now, she was very nervous. She had to act quickly. She was relieved that her swordsmanship aura manifested properly. She wasn't tired at all after climbing the tower and opened a huge door that was frozen effortlessly. This meant she was physically as strong as Julia had been when in power, and thus, Eustace was the only one who could defeat her, so there was no need to be afraid. She stood up and declared that if he truly served her with loyalty, even after she reported the things he had done, there was nothing to feel guilty about. He just nervously began shaking, unable to come up with something to say. Inside her head, Julia laughed at how those were the words of her former manager, which had led to her dismissal that day. No matter how much he prepared, if she followed through with her plans and found one mistake, he would become nervous. Of course, that was only if he had something to be nervous about. She looked back down at him and declared, "Why don't you take today off?" When he heard this, he looked down, clearly anxious. She simply wanted to dispose of him and clear all the office clutter. She needed to attend to her own duties, so he had to leave. He tried to continue talking, wanting to escape the situation. He commented that there was no reason for her to do such dirty work. That's when she glared at him and asked if he dared to challenge her authority. If so, he should challenge her right there. She would not run away. She declared her aura emanated from her. Duke Fez was so terrified that he fell to the ground. He lowered his head and declared that her humble servant had been presumptuous. However, he questioned why she had come back to her senses, wondering if the dosage had been too low yesterday. She laughed, stating that he was her most loyal servant, and decided to stop there for now. When he heard this, he was delighted, declaring, "That's right, Your Majesty. This humble servant worked all this time only for your sake." She commented that she was really just teasing him since he had been working so hard. She thought that should be enough. Unfortunately for him, he couldn't even sense her intentions. She declared that she would soon give him a handsome reward, so he must rest and relax for 4 days. Obviously confused, he wondered just how many places he could lack in his ability. In the first place, it was a coincidence that she had involved him in internal affairs. It was because the previous duke had died without a successor, and then he, being the only blood relative, had inherited the title. She couldn't believe it had ended up like this while she was busy in the war. She felt amused at the thought. She could never manage state affairs without him. She began to see things more clearly. With a smile on her face, she assured him that she was aware of his loyalty. However, as she turned around and was unable to see his face, she became very angry. She was sick of playing nice with him. Maybe it was because she had looked at his face for too long or gotten too worked up, but she didn't even have time to be angry now. First of all, she needed to find out what the Duke was doing and clean up his mess. She ordered Plana to take the maids and bring all the documents from the place where Duke Fez worked and looked up information, emphasizing that she must make good excuses. When she thought about it, she felt sorry for them. Julia, whom they were so loyal to, was not really herself. In fact, she had even stolen Julia's body. As a result, she felt the need to work harder. She ordered another maid to bring her the documents about the execution. Next, there was Felix, who was loudly waiting for her orders. She pondered what business a 17-year-old boy had looking so adorable to the point that she could hardly look at him. The boy with his curly ginger hair and black eyes always wore a glowing face when he saw Julia, fearing that he would ever disappoint her. He always acted harmless in front of her, but that was only when he could see her. There was no way he could have become an archmage with that attitude. Felix behaved like a gentle sheep in front of Julia, but he was somewhat shy around her and the servants. Apart from that, he was merciless. For example, he could confront any nobleman who had wronged Julia. He had nightmares after that. He didn't last a week. After a bit of time, the nobleman came back bowing and declaring that he was wrong. After seeing the change in attitude, Felix declared that he must have just realized Julia's magnificence. It was a true blessing that he was so kind toward Julia. Even though he was a servant of the Empress, he was still subject to punishment for laying a hand and the nobility. However, no one would dare speak up against him out of fear. Julia had always known this, but chose to turn a blind eye. It was cute to see him pretend that he had never done anything wrong, especially since no one accused Felix. She ordered him to keep an eye on Duke Fez and cut off any contacts he may have. This was a simple task, of course. The other task would be easily done. Felix began conjuring a magic circle. She then realized that he was using the fountain pen Julia had given him. She told him that she wanted the climate of the Tower of Exiles to be stable for a few days, but he commented on it. She told him yes, some people were still trapped there because of Duke Fez. She wanted him to do it only until their names were checked and dealt with. She noticed that he seemed strangely motivated, but it was something to be motivated for. She felt like he had always hated Duke Fez, as Duke Fez was genuinely incompetent and had even tampered with the Emperor's authority. After all, Julia's confidence in Eustace was not something Duke Fez appreciated. To Felix, Duke Fez was nothing more than a scumbag. There were plenty of reasons to hate the Duke, but Felix couldn't bring it up easily because the Empress had taken the Duke's side. Now that the same Julia was planning to take down Duke Fez, he must be so excited. She also ordered him to find someone's transgressions in those documents about the Duke, which the maids had brought. Thanks to Julia's knowledge, it was easy to read the text. First, she needed to find material that could release Count Venus. After reviewing the documents, she declared that Venus would be released due to a lack of evidence. However, she still couldn't get over the fact that this report looked just like Manager Lee's. Manager Lee tended to think that a long, detailed report was better than a one-page summary. He focused more on hours worked rather than the quality or quantity of work. He was a typical incompetent. Thanks to him, she had to read every line because nothing got to the point. If she kept using that guy, this country was doomed. Plana entered her room, bringing her tea for a break. It was hot tea, but the main question was whether it fit her taste. It was only 2 years ago when Julia had enjoyed drinking this while planning operations. It had a refreshing aroma that cleared her head, but it was very difficult to grow and refine. Special attention needed to be paid to the water temperature and brewing time. If it went wrong, it tasted grossly bitter. But when made properly, it became a great drink, slightly sour yet refreshing. Plana had made this tea for Julia herself and even brewed it with her own hands. If Julia had something like this, she would never have needed to drink terrible coffee. When she thought of this recipe, she felt like applauding Plana. This was her struggle for a single person. There was no way she wouldn't appreciate her gesture. She declared that it would have been a real shame if she had forgotten about this taste. Suddenly, some guards arrived, surprising her. They revealed that the captain of the guards had requested an audience. Eustace entered the room with his green emerald eyes looking stern. though he seemed a bit nervous. She told him to take a seat. He questioned what she was thinking. She ordered the release of Count Venus, saying that the charges filed by Duke Fez against him were lacking. Eustace wondered if that was really the truth. If it wasn't, what was? It must be confusing for Eustace. The usual Julia wouldn't do such a thing, which meant that Eustace would be troubled, but there were only 2 days left. She left any matter she could to live, even if it showed Eustace's mind was in chaos. She questioned if he thought she wasn't serious, and seeing that he had no answer, she mused whether that meant he didn't believe in her. Julia's smile had been Eustace's favorite until 2 years ago when she had been so confident in herself. He had given her his loyalty and compassion, but now it was painful because he couldn't believe in her. It had only been 3 days since he admitted that the version of Julia he knew was dead, but she couldn't have changed so much in just a few days. Feeling despair wash over her, she slumped her head on the table, thinking that she was going to die. Eustace had a suspicious look right before he left, but this was hard for her to deal with. She couldn't push him away, nor could she let him stay. Aside from feeling bad, she was also very tired. Suddenly, Venus arrived, asking if he was interrupting anything. She quickly got up and greeted him. He lowered his head and seemed nervous. He informed her that he hadn't properly advised her. He confirmed that he had done all of this because of Duke Marcus. She questioned if he had said that on purpose. While drinking some tea, he confirmed it, which made her angry because she knew that he didn't want to end his life, but she would just go with it for now. She declared that she was glad he was okay. He responded that it was thanks to Her Majesty's prompt handling of the matter, as there wasn't much time left, and he wanted the accusations to be made immediately. He clarified all the irregularities in Duke Fez's handling of internal affairs and presented a small document with his findings. As she read it, she discovered that the years of activities were easy to see and detailed. Duke Fez had been subtly eating away at the Treasury's funds here and there. The investments were small at first, but it got worse the further back they checked. Particularly last year, he had siphoned off her budget. Julia thought people were stealing so much money right under her nose while the people responsible for keeping an eye on the budget were working right alongside him, leaving her to ponder how many people they had to expose for being in Venus' pocket. He had pulled up more documents, showing that he had it all figured out. He must have a strong urge to screw over all those corrupt nobles. Either way, these processed documents were very valuable, meaning she would be working overnight today. The next day, she woke up out of bed, realizing it was the last day. If she didn't manage the budget issue properly, a revolution would take place tomorrow. That's why she had stayed up all night reviewing the material to be announced and ordering the nobles to come to the palace. She had to perform well today to survive. So far, things had worked better than she expected. However, Duke Fez had apparently not made any suspicious movements, but she wouldn't believe that so easily. According to Felix's surveillance, he went about his business without a care in the world. He had been furious when he suddenly received an order to go to the palace, which meant that Duke Fez was probably preparing something for today. She didn't want to work, nor did she want to go to this meeting, but she had to because she was the Empress. Upon her entry, a guard declared, "Her Majesty, the Lord of the Empire, has arrived."